To come speak with you today. I have to be honest with you, this is my first major Zoom presentation since lockdown, and I've done lots of Zoom meetings, so hopefully everything goes smoothly here. Can you guys see the screen okay?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so, well, I already got the introduction from the president, Bob, Pres Bob here on the screen. My name is Matthew Albrecht. I'm a conservation scientist at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And I'm going to talk with you guys today about rare plant conservation work in the North American Central Highlands. And I know my original title said Midwest, but I thought I would be more ecologically accurate and use North American Central Highlands, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment. So if you guys are interested in learning more about my research and the work I'm doing at the Missouri Botanical Garden, I would encourage you to go to my website, plantconservation.weebly.com. It's at the bottom of the screen there. You can find information about our projects. You can find links to our publications and various other students that work in my lab that work on conservation issues here in the region. So I'm not going to be able to talk to you guys in 45 minutes or so about all of our work that we're doing in our lab, but I thought I would sort of talk to you guys a bit about some natural history of rare species within the region, some species that we've been working with, and the kinds of research we're doing in my lab to help sort of stave off the extinction of these species in the wild. And I'd like to first, though, kind of talk big picture and talk about more generally why we're doing conservation work at the Missouri Botanical Garden in this region of the Midwestern United States. And here I'm showing you a map, and I know there's a lot going on here, but let me just walk you through this because this map is really important. It highlights a really important point in our work. This is some work from the Nature Conservancy back in the mid-2000s. And what they did is they went around across the world and they looked at different biomes. So things like deserts, temperate forests, tropical forest, shrublands, temperate grasslands, tropical grasslands, and they looked at how much habitat has been lost within each one of those biomes. And they also looked at how much habitat has been protected in those biomes. And if you look at that ratio, and on this slide in the middle, you see CRI, that's the Conservation Risk Index. That's basically the ratio of how much habitat has been converted versus how much habitat has been protected within that biome. And if you look at that map, look where we stand here in the Midwest. It's bright red. We're living in a critical crisis ecoregion, right? So most of our grasslands have been converted to some other land use form, whether it's agriculture or development. We've lost probably over 95% of our tallgrass prairies here in the Midwest. We've lost almost all of our savannas as well, particularly here in the Ozarks. And not far behind, to many people's surprise, are temperate broadleaf and mixed forests, which we have here in the Ozarks of Missouri as well. And while you might think, geez, there are lots of forest and woodlands when I drive through the Ozarks, the issue is that many of those woodlands are fundamentally different than what they used to be. And the amount of biodiversity that they contain is often much lower than what it was historically. So I think this really helps sets the stage for us. And we typically think at the Missouri Botanical Garden about these far off tropical places as being these places of sort of crisis, critical, mass destruction and deforestation. But the point I wanted to bring home with this particular map is that right here in temperate North America, we are really sitting in the middle of a crisis ecoregion. And so most of my work is focused on rare and endangered plants in this region. And what I'm showing you in this graph is the number of species on the Endangered Species Act according to each of the different taxonomic groups. So we have plants, we have fishes, we have birds, we have mammals, reptiles, et cetera, et cetera. And something should jump out at you, and that's that a disproportionate number of species on the Endangered Species Act are plants. And if you even add up all the animals on this list, it still doesn't equal the number of plants. And I have to say these numbers are a little bit outdated. These are a few years old. I need to update them. Right now, there are over 1,000 species that are listed as threatened or endangered on the Endangered Species Act. So plants are really the sort of disenfranchised poor in all this. And what do I mean by that? If we look at how much money the government spends per year per species that's listed on the Endangered Species Act, what do we see? We see that most of the funding goes to our large charismatic animals, things like the northern spotted owl. So our birds, mammals, and fish get a vast majority of the funding for conservation work. And look at plants. We're last on the list. Plants receive the least amount of conservation funding from the US government. And the orange line, and I don't want to get too deep into this graphic, but the orange line is basically showing us the proportion of species declining in each one of these groups. And what this graph is basically telling us is that if we spend money and we put the resources towards conservation, we can usually help reverse the decline of a species in the wild. And so when we throw lots of money at the northern spotted owl, when we throw lots of money at these big charismatic animals, there's a good chance that we can actually keep them from going extinct in the wild. But we have to have the resources, and plants really haven't been getting their fair share of resources over the past few decades in this sort of limited time of funding. And that's where an organization called the Center for Plant Conservation comes into play. So the Center for Plant Conservation is a network of botanical gardens across North America. Missouri Botanical Garden is one of the founding participating members in this network of botanic gardens. And the Center for Plant Conservation used to be headquartered here at the Missouri Botanical Garden. It's since moved to San Diego Zoo back in about 2015. But really what they are is they're an office that's essentially helping to coordinate conservation efforts across the United States. And what each one of these botanical gardens is doing within this network is working on issues related to, conservation issues related to rare, endangered, and threatened species in their region. And so the Missouri Botanical Garden's actually been doing this for about 30 years. When I started at the Botanical Garden in 2007, this is my sort of primary line of work at the garden is being the main point person for the institution to the Center for Plant Conservation. And so most of my work is sort of organized around working with threatened and endangered species in this region and using sort of techniques that are somewhat unique to botanical gardens. And botanical gardens are really uniquely positioned to do conservation work with plants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But I wanted to talk about the region we're working in. And let me go back to this map for a second. I think something will become clear. If you look south of St. Louis, south of the Missouri Botanical Garden, you see very few botanical gardens working. Actually, there are no botanical gardens working in the Ozarks, Arkansas, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. There's this huge void geographically, and you can see lots of gardens concentrated out in California, fair share out in the Southwest, and then in the upper Midwest, there are quite a few gardens, and in Florida, but there's a sort of big void in the Mid-South. And that's where we kind of focus most of our work with rare plant species. So I call this region, and other ecologists have called this region the North American Central Highlands. And the North American Central Highlands is essentially sort of regions of uplift within Central North America. So the Ozark Highlands, which you guys I'm sure are familiar with, which is illustrated there in the purple shading on the map. And these different color shadings, by the way, are EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, level 3 ecoregions. And I'm just sort of pointing out the three major ones that we're working in at the Missouri Botanical Garden. So we're working in the Ozark Highlands, and each one of those dots you see on this map is the location of a species that's either globally imperiled, critically imperiled, or vulnerable to extinction in the wild. And this map represents about 100 different plant species that we've identified in these categories across these regions. So we've got the Ozark Highlands, we've got the Ouachita Mountains to the south of the Ozark Highlands in Arkansas, this western Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma. Ouachitas have a high concentration of endemic species found nowhere else in the world. Many of them are incredibly rare in the wild and potentially threatened with extinction. And then another region that we've been working extensively in is to the east of the Mississippi River is the interior low plateau, which is shaded in the orange. And you can see a concentration of dots in the middle of Tennessee there. That's called the Central Basin of Tennessee, home to a globally endangered ecosystem called limestone cedar glades. This is just south and east of Nashville, Tennessee. And there are whole lots of species there that are incredibly rare, endemic, and threatened with extinction in the wild. And we've been very active with our work there as well. And one of our goals with this map is to, over time, we targeted each one of these locations to seed bank these species that are potentially threatened with extinction. And well, let me kind of getting ahead of myself here. Let me back up just for a moment. There are really kind of two forms of conservation when we think about working in the realm of plant conservation. And maybe you guys have heard of these or not, I'm not sure, but we have coarse filter conservation. And this is the idea of the way we conserve biodiversity is by setting aside protected areas, natural areas, and managing them for biodiversity, setting aside parks and areas that are designed to be free of development and other improper land use practices that might harm biodiversity. So that's a coarse filter conservation strategy. And the idea there is if we strategically place our reserves and protect the right areas, we can, by and large, capture a vast majority of biodiversity in a region with a network of nature reserves across that region. But really, for many of these plant species, those 1,000 species listed on the Endangered Species Act, many of them sort of fall through the cracks of this coarse filter conservation. And we need another strategy. We need a fine filter conservation strategy. What do I mean by that? I mean, we need to take a species by species approach because many of these species are threatened with extinction and they have a problem and they need a solution. And oftentimes it's not just protecting their habitat. Maybe their habitat's no longer protectable, but oftentimes these species have some issue, whether it's they've lost pollinators, whether processes that are important for them, such as fire, are no longer operating in their native habitats. Maybe the food web is out of sync, and maybe there's an overpopulation of deer or other mammals that are basically preying upon these rare species. In these particular cases, we often have to solve a conservation problem. And oftentimes they revolve around genetic problems. So over the past couple hundred years, we've seen some species, due to improper land use practices, end up having some sort of genetic problem that we need to fix. They maybe no longer can reproduce in the wild. And I'll give you an example of that in a little while. And so my lab is really sort of operating under 4 themes under this fine filter conservation strategy. The first is ex situ conservation, which is a fancy word for meaning conserving organisms outside of their natural habitat. That would be seed banking these species at the botanical garden. We're actively involved in reintroducing these rare species back into the wild and into protected areas. And we're really involved in a lot of population management, trying to figure out solutions to manage the habitat of rare species to ensure their long-term viability. And then increasingly, we're working on habitat restoration as well, because many of the habitats these rare species depend upon are oftentimes degraded, and we need to reverse that ecological degradation. So the garden has been doing this for about 35 years now as part of the Center for Plant Conservation Network. And right now we have 81 species within this region that are listed as globally critically imperiled, or vulnerable with extinction. And we have over 2,000 seed bank accessions. I'm showing you just some of my favorite species. Some of these are native to the Ozarks. Some of them are native to the interior low plateau east of the Mississippi River. But our goal over the long term is to try to seed bank from as many of these species and populations as possible. And what our seed bank is really serving is a backup in case these species and populations go extinct in the wild. And our sort of frozen seed bank is essentially a repository of genetic material. Think about them as being an insurance policy, right? So you wouldn't want to go driving your car around without an insurance policy. We kind of view our seed bank as an insurance policy. In case something were to happen to these species and populations in the wild, we have a backup of their genetic material in our seed bank that we can actually restore or reintroduce those species back into the wild. And this is sort of fundamentally different than what zoos are able to do, right? So with plants, we're actually able to go out, we can collect seed from individual plants within populations. We can try to collect across many different populations over many different years. And by doing this, we can capture a vast majority of the genetic variation of these species. And we can back that genetic variation up in our seed bank. Zoos have problems with endangered animals, right? Because zoos have to keep animals alive, and it's very difficult to keep lots of animals alive. So zoo populations tend to have low genetic diversity within their captive populations. And that's a sort of stark alternative to what we can do with plants. is we can actually, in most cases, conserve a lot of the genetic variation by seeds, assuming these species are still producing seeds in the wild. We have examples where some species are no longer producing seeds anymore in the wild, and we have to use alternative methods. So some people often ask me, well, why do you collect seeds and freeze the seeds? Why not just grow the plants at the botanical garden? And one of the issues with growing plants at the botanical garden, we do some of that, but we really can't grow as many plants that we would need to in order to capture the full range of genetic variability in these species. It's also really expensive to maintain plants, and they get diseased. There's issues with inbreeding in small populations in the botanical garden. And so while some species have to be conserved in our living collection at the garden because they don't produce seed anymore, a vast majority of them we can back up in our seed bank, and we can back up quite a bit of genetic diversity within that seed bank. And let me give you an example of the importance of seed bank for plant conservation. So this is a little species, this is a little mustard called Paysonia lyrata, lyrate's bladder plod. It's endemic to a small section of northwestern Alabama, the limestone glades there. And so in that map in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a few counties highlighted in yellow. That's where this species is known from. This species is only known from 3 populations in the whole world in northwestern Alabama. 2 of those populations are on private property. One is on a roadside, and I'm showing you there in the picture. The only thing protecting that population is a sign telling the road crew to not spray herbicide on the roadside. It says, do not spray endangered species. The other population is essentially in development. It's actually an old, it's really like an old farm property that's now sort of being developed. Their property is being developed around it, and that site is for sale. And that site will inevitably be developed in the future. And plants typically have no protection when they're growing on private property. So it's most likely that in the near future, that population growing on that private property will be destroyed by development. And so we were able to seed bank this species and seed bank from all 3 populations. And if you think about this, only one of the known populations is in a protected area. So by seed banking this species, we've been able to capture all of the known genetic variation of the species. And it's likely that 2 of the 3 populations will be extinct in the future, because inevitably that sign will be ignored and herbicide will be sprayed on that roadside at some point in the future. So this is just an example of how our seed banks function as an insurance policy. Another research theme in my lab is not just seed banking, but actually doing research on seeds to try to understand how to germinate them. And so it's all good and well to seed banks these rare species, but we really need to be able to pull the seed out of the seed bank and use that seed for conservation work and for restoration work in order to restore these species. Our seed bank is not just an insurance policy, but it's an active seed bank that we use to conduct research on rare species to better understand their biology. That way we can better design conservation and management strategies for these species in the wild. And I'm showing you a basic graphic here of the process of a seed germinating and the factors involved in breaking seed dormancy and making a seed germinate. So almost all the seeds here in temperate North America are dormant when they're mature, when we collect them. And they typically have to go through some temperature sequence to come out of dormancy. Now, some species require fluctuating wet and dry conditions to come out of dormancy. Some species require cold temperature. Some species require warm and cold temperatures. And a lot of the work in my lab is trying to figure out what those ingredients are to make those seeds actually germinate. And increasingly so, we're sort of focusing on our work on other factors that might be important. For example, some research over the past decade or so has shown smoke compounds are very important for some species and triggering them to germinate. So smoke compounds that are derived from vegetation that's burnt during wildfires or prescribed burns can be important. And so my research in my lab is really trying to understand what factors are important for these rare species and getting them to germinate. And I'd like to tell a few stories on some of the interesting natural tidbits and adaptations that we've been discovering in some rare species throughout this North American Central Highlands. So many of the species we work with are isolated to specific geologic features in the landscape. And this is one example. This is Ozark Spring Beauty, Claytonia arkansana. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, hey, I think I know this species, it grows in my yard. No, this is a very rare species known from only handful of sites, in 3 counties in central Arkansas. It's closely related to the more common spring beauty that we all see in the spring, growing in our lawn, growing in our woodlands. But this species is different. It only grows on these sandstone rock outcrops in north central Arkansas. And there's a picture in the upper left of it sort of hanging off these sandstone bluffs. And this species is actually relatively new to science. It was described back in the mid-2000s. It was a species that was really overlooked by botanists. So it's a new species to science. And when it was recently described, my team went out to go seed bank this species because it was only known from a handful of sites. And so it's incredibly rare. And this is a typical spring beauty in that it blooms early in spring. And when we went out in late spring to collect the fruits, we noticed something interesting. In the spring, the flowers were hanging off the cliff, and pollinators would come and visit those flowers. In late spring, we noticed that the flowering stalks had bent back into the cliff and were depositing the seeds into crevices of the cliff. And that's what you see in that middle circular picture with the caption late spring. That's actually the fruit of an Ozark spring beauty depositing seeds into these dark crevices of this cliff. It's a very unique adaptation. We had to take long tweezers to actually pull a lot of those seeds out of those crevices in order to actually collect them. And we got to thinking about it, and this is really an adaptation to maintain populations in these unique sandstone outcrops, because if you let your seeds drop off the bluff into the surrounding forest below it, it's possible that's not suitable habitat for this species. So it's basically maintaining itself by keeping itself on this cliff through this very unique physiological response. And it turns out that when we did germination research with this species germinates only in the dark. So it sort of adapted to these dark conditions within these sandstone crevices. So this is a kind of fun example of a species that has these sort of unique seed dispersal and germination adaptations to live on these rock outcrops in north central Arkansas. And let me tell you another story about another species we've been working with that's a lot of fun. This is white-haired goldenrod, Solidago albopilosa. This is a species known from the Red River Gorge in Kentucky. And if you look at the map on the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a few counties highlighted in yellow there in Kentucky. Kentucky is highlighted in green. That's where this species is known from. And this is one of the sort of wild success stories of plant conservation within the North American Central Highlands. So this incredibly rare goldenrod only grows in the Red River Gorge, and it was formerly listed on the Endangered Species Act. But in 2016, it was delisted due to successful conservation efforts. And I'd like to talk about those just for a moment so you can get a sense of what it looks like for a species to actually be recovered in the wild. So if you're not familiar with the Red River Gorge, this is what it looks like. It's an incredible landscape. It's basically like a mini Grand Canyon carved out by the Red River in Kentucky. It's a very topographically complex area. It's all sandstone. Beautiful landscape to hike around in. And it's known for these incredible sandstone formations. This is Gray's Arch. So people come all over to see these incredible sandstorm formations and natural arches that form within this landscape. It's also one of the world's rock climbing meccas. So people come from all over the world to go rock climbing along these sandstone cliffs in Kentucky in the Red River Gorge. And here's a rock climber scaling the sides of one of these cliffs. And if you look below the rock climber at the bottom of the picture, you'll see some green plants growing underneath him. That's where white-haired goldenrod grows. And that's where a whole host of species sort of specialize on this very unique habitat at the bottom of these cliffs. And it's a very dark, cave-like habitat that a handful of species seem to specialize on, and white-haired goldenrod's one of them. Here's a better look at one of these habitats. They call these sandstone rock houses. And it's hard in a picture to describe the scale of this habitat, but these are huge. These are very large, basically recessed shelters within these cliffs. And we know for centuries, Native Americans have occupied these shelters and used these shelters, these rock houses. Early American settlers used these rock shelters and rock houses for habitat. And these plants typically only grow behind the drip line of the cliff above them. So they grow in really sandy soil. it's dark, and in the summer, it's really cool in these rock houses, much cooler than it is in the surrounding forest. And in the winter, it's much warmer. And in fact, if you look carefully on the walls of these rock houses, you find remnants of tropical ecosystems on the walls because of the moderated climate. So there are these ferns and firm gametophytes that are of tropical origin that live on the walls of these rock houses. So they're constantly moist and they have these moderated temperatures all year long. So it's a very unique microclimate within these rock houses. Here's another vantage point of one of these rock houses, and that's white-hair goldenrod growing all up and down different levels within one of these sandstone rock outcrops. So the problem has been is that the Red River Gorge is a very popular tourist destination, and most of the trails and rock climbing access points occur at the base of these rock houses, exactly where white-hair goldenrod and other rare species grow. And what was happening, this is an example of one of these rock houses that has been fenced off. It's been fenced off because this particular site has significant archaeological, it's a significant archaeological site that the Forest Service is trying to protect from tourists and campers and hikers and rock climbers and so forth. But what's happened over the years is through basically people camping and hiking and rock climbing is that these rock houses have slowly become devegetated. So here's an example of one of these rock houses. What do you see? You don't see much besides rocks and sand because all the plants have largely disappeared. And this is a site that's had heavy camping use. And the plants in this habitat are very sensitive to trampoline. So they have very shallow root systems and they grow in this really sandy soil. And so any sort of trampoline is usually detrimental to these species. And this is exactly what happened to white-hair goldenrod. For several decades, the species declined. It disappeared from many of these rock houses, and it was listed on the Endangered Species Act. Here's another example of one of these rock houses that is widely used for camping. You can see the large campfire pit there. So what the Forest Service began to do is they began to fence off these rock houses and to keep people from getting inside of them. They began rerouting trails around rock houses where white-hair goldenrod grows or used to grow. And slowly over time, white-hair goldenrod made a comeback within these rock houses. And slowly over time, new occurrences were found and the populations rebounded. And there was a really strong education campaign to the rock climbing community and to the hiking community that these rock shelters were really sensitive habitat. And we need to be really careful when we're using them or walking through them or using them to access rock climbing points. And so it turns out that these simple steps of basically fencing, education, and rerouting trails ended up helping to conserve this species to the point that they were able to delist it from the Endangered Species Act. And as part of that delisting on the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asked us to come out and seed bank this species before they delisted it. It was the one sort of action of recovery that they hadn't completed yet for the species. So they wanted a backup of as much genetic material of the species as possible in our frozen seed bank. So this was one of our really fun projects that we did for 2 years. We went out to as many sites as possible that we could find for white-hair goldenrod, and we collected seed of the species, and it's all backed up in our seed bank at the Missouri Botanical Garden and at Fort Collins, Colorado, where we have a partnership with the USDA National Seed Bank at Colorado State University. And this was an incredibly fun project. I just wanted to share some of the, some of the sort of fantastic features of the Red River Gorge. This is a place called Indian Staircase. Legend has it that Native Americans carved out these pockets within this cliff, and you can climb up this cliff using these notches carved out in the rock to get to the top of this cliff. And so we had to use this trail to get to one of our sites to collect seed of white-hair goldenrod. And if you ever have a chance to go to Red River Gorge, I'd highly recommend it. It's an incredible landscape. It's like a jungle gym for people who like the outdoors. And for decades, rock climbers have created their own trail system that there's maps for online. And they've created ropes and access points in their own trails. And here I am using one of the rock climbing trails that has a permanent rope attached to it to get up to one of these sites. This is a very difficult landscape to move around in. It's incredibly rugged, it's incredibly steep, it's a very treacherous and sometimes dangerous landscape if you're not careful. But this was an incredible project to be able to get deep into the Red River Gorge and to collect seed of this incredibly unusual and rare species. So here we are collecting seed. That's me lying down. I crawled up into one of these rock houses to collect seed of white-haired goldenrod. On the right-hand side, that's Dr. Quinn Long, who's now the director of the Shaw Nature Reserve. At this time, back in 2016, he was working with me on this project, and he actually helped spearhead this project. So that's a large population of white-haired goldenrod that he's collecting from in this project. And much like the Ozark Spring Beauty I showed you earlier, this goldenrod also seems to have sort of some unique features about its germination biology to live in this habitat. And when we think about goldenrods, we typically think about, these species that are kind of weedy. They like open habitats. And we know that most of those weedy goldenrods of open grasslands and other types of open habitats, they typically require light for their seeds to germinate. And they can also form persistent soil seed banks, so their seeds can remain dormant for many years in the soil. And this goldenrod is just the opposite. This goldenrod does not need light. It can germinate equally as well in darkness or light. And this goldenrod, I think, is starting to show adaptations to living in this sort of moderated microclimate in the winter. So most species in the temperate region need long periods of winter cold to come out of seed dormancy. And they need long periods of winter cold because if they germinate too early in winter and they emerge as a seedling, they might get zapped by a frost in early spring. And so it's really important to time your germination correctly in spring. But in the rock houses, the climate's very moderated and it doesn't really get below freezing that much. And so it appears this species is losing, compared to other goldenrods, a longer stratification requirement. So if we just give it 4 weeks of cold stratification, it seems to come out of dormancy very, very easily and can germinate equally as well in light or darkness. And in fact, it starts germinating at winter temperatures, which is also highly unusual for plants in this region. So it's a species that's starting to show, I think, adaptations to this sort of unique rock house habitat. So another species that we've been working with in my lab is the federally endangered Astragalus bibulatus Pines ground plum. This is a species that's endemic to the central basin of Tennessee. I mentioned limestone cedar glades earlier. This is one of the endemics to limestone cedar glades, south of Nashville, Tennessee. And this species is known from only about a half a dozen sites or so in the wild. And what I'm showing you in the lower map there, that's sort of a blowout of the area where you can find Astragalus bibulatus. So each one of those open circles in the shaded box, that's a known location of this species, Pines ground plum. And most of the known populations are distributed along about a 1.5 mile stretch of county road on limestone glades that are adjacent to the roadside. So it's an incredibly narrowly restricted species. And it's highly at risk of extinction with such a narrow geographic distribution. So if you imagine one disturbance happening along that roadside, whether it's a roadside crew spraying herbicide, whether it's some sort of unique weather event, a derecho, a tornado, or something that dramatically alters the habitat or causes a very large-scale disturbance, most of the global populations of this species would be at risk of going extinct. And so we've been working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Tennessee Department of Conservation to help conserve this species. And the Botanical Garden's been involved in 20 years of conservation efforts with this particular limestone cedar glade endemic. I don't have time to talk about all of our work with this species because that would take another 45 minutes. But I wanted to talk about a topic that I think is really relevant to some pertinent management issues here in Missouri's grasslands and woodlands, and that has to do with fire. And so our research early on with Pines ground plum suggested that this species is really vulnerable to woody vegetation encroachment, and most of the habitats and sites the species grows in have not been managed with fire or any other sort of disturbance that might remove woody vegetation. And we've done several different experiments to suggest this is really an open grassland species, but most of these sites have become incredibly encroached with cedar and other invasive woody vegetation, and that vegetation needs to be removed. And we started digging into some historical information, and we really think that historically these limestone cedar glades, the areas around them used to burn, and fire was an essential process within the system, and that many of the species that are in decline and endangered are maybe fire-adapted species. And if we can return fire to this ecosystem, we may help to manage the remaining populations of several of these endemic species. And so the Conservation Department began using fire, but the topic came up of when should we be burning and what time of the year should we be burning the species. So typically prescribed burns are conducted in early spring. And that's when the Conservation Department in Tennessee began burning habitats that had populations of Pines ground plum. Well, it turns out that it looked like populations of Pines ground plum were not responding very well. And this is a species that begins to emerge very early in spring, usually in March, sometimes even earlier. And we started to suspect that these fires in early March were maybe detrimental to the species as it was beginning to emerge. So we set up an experiment at the Shaw Nature Reserve, where we set up experimental populations of Pines ground plum. And we burned them at different times based on the phenology of when the species began to leaf out. I know this figure might be a little bit hard to see, these images, but we essentially had two treatments. We burned during the dormant season, and then we burned right as the leaves were emerging. So the dormant season on your left was in February. And you see green leaves, so this species will keep its leaves green, but it's not actively growing. There are no new shoots coming up out of the ground. If you look in the picture in March, I have some arrows next to some of those. Those are little buds coming up out of the ground. And that's when fires had traditionally been timed by the Conservation Department. We think that maybe that was just a little bit too late. And that's why this species was negatively responding to fire. And so sure enough, when we conducted our experiment, we followed the fates of these individuals that we experimentally burned. Let me go back to these burn boxes. So we created these burn boxes, and we burned replicate sets of plants in these burn boxes at these different times of the year. And then we followed the response of how the individual plants responded to those different burn treatments. And it turns out that when you burn in that early spring window of early March, you get much lower chance of flowering in Pines ground plum compared to when you burn in the dormant season, or even compared to the controls. So burning is really detrimental to this particular species flowering if you burn in early spring. And here on the right-hand graphic, I'm showing you we counted the number of flower buds in the early spring burn treatment, and we compared the number of flower buds after we burned. And you can see there's a significant decline there in the chances of plants flowering after an early spring burn. So there's a direct effect of fire. It doesn't kill the individual plant. It just basically knocks it back. It scorches the buds, and then when it resprouts, it decides it doesn't want to flower that year. And this is likely due to stress. The other interesting thing we found, though, is we found that although plants in the control and dormant had similar chances of flowering on the left-hand side, the plants had similar chances of flowering in that whether or not they were burned in the dormant season or in the control, which experienced no fire. When we looked at plants in the dormant season, it turns out those plants produced a lot more fruit than they did in the controls. And what we think is happening here is that fire basically burns off litter, burns off grass litter, little blue stem litter. And this is a very low growing species that puts its flowers just a few inches above ground. And so what we think is happening when you burn is that the flowers become much more visible to pollinators. And so they're a lot more likely to visit flowers and transfer pollen from one plant to another. And so fire, I think, is really helping to facilitate reproduction in the species as long as we burn at the right time of the year. If we don't burn at the right time of the year, we're actually probably doing more damage. So fire season is a really hot topic in how we manage our native ecosystems here in Missouri and beyond. And this is a study that really directly addresses this issue of when is appropriate to burn to manage a population of an endangered species. And finally, I want to end with a Missouri species and a Missouri story. After all, this is a Missouri Master Naturalist program. And we just finished up a project with a species that's endemic to tallgrass prairies here in the Midwest, Mead's milkweed, Asclepias meadii. And this is a project that we started a couple years ago in conjunction and in collaboration with the Missouri Department of Conservation, who have noticed for many years that Mead's milkweed populations that grow in prairies, remnant prairies in western Missouri, were no longer producing fruits or seed, or rarely producing fruits and seed. And they wanted to know what happened and why is this species no longer producing fruits and seed in the wild. Asclepias medii is a federally threatened species. We know it used to occur in Missouri, throughout Missouri, in the prairie region. There are populations known in Iowa and Illinois, and there used to be populations in Indiana, and there are lots of populations in Kansas prairies. And Asclepias medii is an obligate outcrosser. So it requires pollen to be moved from a genetically unrelated individual to another individual that's unrelated to produce seed. So you have to have genetic diversity in a population in order for this species to produce seed. And the traditional thinking among conservationists has been that, well, I think what's happened is that this species doesn't produce seed anymore because most of the populations only have a few individuals that are not genetically related left in them. And so we basically have a bunch of closely related individuals that are not able to cross-pollinate each other, and that's why we don't see seed. So they think there's been some genetic bottleneck that has happened over time. And so we set up a study with my collaborator, Dr. Christy Edwards, who's really the lead PI on this project. She's a population geneticist at the Missouri Botanical Garden. And what Christy and I and our teams did is we went out to a whole bunch of prairies that you see on the map there in western Missouri and eastern Kansas. And then there are two outlier populations of Mead's milkweed that grow in the Tom Sauk region, that grow in granite glades. And we went out to all these sites and we crawled around the prairie in early summer to find every stem of Mead's milkweed that we could find. And we tagged that stem. We collected a leaf to do a genetic analysis on it. And then we came back multiple times throughout the summer to look at whether or not those stems flowered and whether or not they produced seed and whether or not that seed was viable. And it turns out that the traditional paradigm is really wrong. When we went out and looked at the genetic data for all these populations, we found that there was plenty of genetic diversity within all these populations, whether or not the populations were small or big. There were lots of unique genetic individuals in those populations, so there was no reason to think that a genetic bottleneck was actually causing a decline in this species. But what it turns out might be happening is that in any given year, in most of these populations that are small, only a handful of individuals will flower. And so the chances of pollen being moved from one plant to another are small just because there are just only a handful of individuals flowering in any given year. And we only see seeds and fruits being produced in populations where you have lots of individuals flowering in any given year. And so this means we need large populations of Mead's milkweed in order to produce fruits and to have successful seed set. And when we looked at the genetic data even closer, the genetic data suggests that this species has very little genetic differentiation among the population. So what this tells us is that historically, before Euro-Americans probably colonized the tallgrass prairie region and created all these prairie fragments in a sea of agricultural land use, that Mead's milkweed once grew in a continuous prairie all across Missouri, Kansas, Iowa, and Illinois, and that there was lots of gene flow. So think about milkweeds with those wind dispersed seeds. Seeds were likely being dispersed all across this prairie biome. And we see lots of genetic diversity, lots of genetic variation in the species being transferred all over the landscape. But in the modern landscape, we just have these tiny little prairie remnant fragments left. And most of those fragments are small, and there are only handfuls of individuals of Mead's milkweeds left. And there are just handfuls of individuals of those that are left that will flower in any given year. And we now know from some new research that probably flowering helps to synchronize flowering in these prairie species like Mead's milkweed and echinacea. So when you burn in a given year, you tend to have synchronized flowering of individuals, and you tend to have higher seed set and fruit production in those years that you burn. Much like what I just showed you in Astragalus bibulatus pines ground plum, that dormant season burning, the plants produced a bunch of fruits. We think that may be happening here with Mead's milkweed as well. And so this is another example of the kind of project we're doing in our lab where we're basically trying to solve are trying to solve a problem with a species and trying to put research data to it so that we can develop a solution to help reverse the decline of the species in the wild. And so this is just one of many examples of projects in my lab, and I would encourage you to go to my website if you want to learn more about some of the other projects we have going with various endangered species in the region. And I'm going to wrap up there because I know my time is running out. I want to first acknowledge the conservation partnerships and funders of this work, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, conservation departments from Tennessee and Missouri, and the Center for Plant Conservation. And I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
So everybody knows I can't mute everybody in the middle of that, so not sure I can unmute everybody. I think I've got a key here. I can certainly mute all, but if I mute all, I'm afraid let me see if I can unmute all. Well, you can unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself and ask questions away.
That was very good, Matthew.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I think I just muted everybody again, including myself. No, I didn't. You should be able to unmute yourself. I just selected, can you unmute?
Yeah. Matthew, I have a question. Did you say that prescribed burning kind of harmonizes the blooming of all that species? They all tend to fruit at the same time?
Synchronize.
Synchronize, thank you.
Let me unmute Matthew. Matthew, you're muted there.
Oh, okay, sorry.
That was my fault, not yours.
The trials of Zoom presentations.
Yeah.
So let me start over. The answer to the question was, is there evidence that fire helps to synchronize flowering in plant populations? And the answer is there's some emerging evidence that suggests yes. So that in years that you burn, you tend to have flowering, more individual plants flowering at the same time, and thus you're increasing the chances that pollen will be moved from one flower to another. In years that you don't burn, there's some evidence that flowering tends to be more spread out of individuals in that population. So you may have some individuals flowering early and then some a little bit later. And so there's a less of a chance that there's going to be overlap and less of a chance that pollinators could be moving, pollen from one plant to another.
I have two questions.
I have a question. You apparently do some genetic sequencing. Is there an effort at Botanical Garden or elsewhere of getting the full DNA sequences of some of these plants? And if you can get that full DNA sequence, is there the possibility of actually recreating an extinct species if something went extinct?
Well, that's a controversial subject. Yes, but I suppose in theory, there has been lots of discussion about the process of de-extinction. We hope that by collecting seeds of these species and backing up seeds, we won't need to go to that sort of more extreme level of genetic, needing that sort of intense level genotyping of individuals. So, I mean, we are doing lots of genetic work to understand how genetic variation is patterned and structured within these rare species. And we're using more and more sophisticated methods where we're beginning to better understand genome-wide what these species look like. We're still at the early phase of doing genome-wide sequencing for some of these species because it's quite expensive to do that kind of work. And right now we're typically dealing with a particular marker called microsatellite markers for most of these species to just understand where genetic diversity occurs in the landscape, and again, how different are populations genetically.
I have two questions. One of them relates to Shaw and to Litzinger. Are there any plans to have those two locations become you know, either show places or places where you do a lot more research for Midwestern rare plants so that, you know, people can actually, you know, see some of these? And second, are any of these plants, could they be commercially viable so that people would want to plant them in their backyards and thereby help save them, you know, just by having a diversity of commercially available, you know, rare plants?
Not every backyard would work.
Okay, so let me tackle the first part of that question. And the answer is yes. We're starting to conduct research projects on rare species within the region at the Shaw Nature Reserve. And the project with Pines Ground Plum I showed you was a project we set up on one of the glades there. If you go to the Whitmire Wildflower Garden, you can actually see many of the Ozark endemic species. There are examples of those at the Whitmire Wildflower Garden at the Shaw Nature Reserve. And more, we're becoming active at the Nature Reserve and trying to reestablish some of these rare species within the region if the habitat's appropriate. And so at the Shaw Nature Reserve, we're focusing on woodlands and glades because that's a native habitat there. And so we're looking at trying to reestablish populations of rare species that are native to our glades and woodlands. To tackle your second question, we have to be careful about bringing endangered species into the nursery trade for a couple of reasons. One, many of these species have genetic issues, and we need to understand their genetics before we can begin to start disseminating their seed widely. There are possible examples of you know, growing rare plants and then growing plants from populations that are uniquely adapted to certain locations, and then those populations exchanging genetics with native populations. And so you have to be really careful about how we're mixing genetic material, where we're planting it. Otherwise, we could be doing eventual harm if the things we're planting in our gardens those genes end up going out into the wild populations. So there is a place for this, but we have to do it carefully. And a lot of the work we do at the garden is we do very careful horticulture conservation with many of these species where we try to learn how to propagate it carefully. Many of them are in the trade already. If you're listed as a federally endangered species, there are lots of strict rules and regulations in selling material of those species for commercial profit. And there are interstate commerce laws, so it can get really tricky. So most vendors shy away from these species that are listed on the Endangered Species Act because there's a series of regulations in place that kind of prevent them from really disseminating and selling those individuals for profit. I also should add too, we've had some issues where people are inappropriately collecting plant material from sensitive wild populations for growing in their garden and in their plant collections. And so that's another issue that could potentially come up in this sort of matter. And so when we're out collecting seed, we're doing this according to guidelines set forth by the Center for Plant Conservation, where we just collect very small quantities of seed at a time so that it's sustainable and we're not doing harm to those populations that we're trying to save. Thank you for your question. Those are great questions.
Matthew, I have a question about, you said that the center and Mobot, that you are in conjunction also with the seed bank in Fort Collins.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do anything with the seed bank in Norway? Is that the international one?
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, so the Svalbard Seed Bank in Norway is primarily focused on agricultural crops and wild crop relatives of those agricultural crops. The Fort Collins Seed Bank also focuses on that, but is also the repository for all seeds collected through the Center for Plant Conservation Network of Botanic Gardens can get sent there. And they basically get put into a black box. In other words, nobody can access those seeds except for the conservationists working at those botanical gardens without their permission. So they're essentially sent to Fort Collins and put away into a black box. And I've seen the black box. It's a giant, it's incredible. The National Seed Bank is a giant 2-story warehouse, essentially, that's frozen. It's negative 20 degrees Celsius. You walk in it, and they have giant compactors with all the seeds in them. It's an incredible operation. But yeah, so most of the seed banks throughout the world tend to focus on agricultural crops, and very few focus on wild plant species. And so that's our unique partnership with Fort Collins.
Matt,
Yeah.
the spring beauty that tucks its seed back in the little crevice,
Yeah.
is that kind of making it I mean, that sounds like a genetic island. How does any of that get dispersed from one spot to another, or does it not? I mean, they're stuck there genetically.
Great question. Well, clearly they're not, because it made it to some other sandstone outcrops in another county. So somehow the species does occasionally do long distance dispersal. How it disperses, I don't know. That'd be a great question. I would suspect that it gets dispersed. Some of these crevices have small deposits of sand. I've seen particular birds maybe come up and perch on these cliffs. Maybe they get little seeds stuck on their feet and they fly to another cliff and then they deposit those seeds. It's sort of a mystery how those seeds move around. And we haven't done any genetic work on that species, but that might help elucidate how frequent, gene flow is happening between these different sandstone outcrops.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Very good. Matthew, again, thank you so much for taking the time, particularly test driving your Zoom expertise here. So yes, real quick. Round of applause for that. Excellent presentation. The chapter definitely appreciates the time you take to do this sort of work. So and I believe that Bob could probably tell us, or some of the other people who watch the hours, but Missouri Botanical Garden gets a significant amount of our volunteer hours. So it's a well-loved place amongst the Master Naturalist program here. We're going to go ahead and head on into our business meeting. You're very welcome to stay along, or you're very welcome to go catch your dinner finally or something. Either way, we're fine with that.
Okay, well, I really appreciate the invitation and thank you for being such a great audience. Hopefully we'll get volunteers back up and running at the garden soon. And maybe I'll hope to see some of you at the garden in the near future. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm going to sneak away and go grab some dinner now.
Right.